It seems clear that this is a very unusual case. That
Absolutely,
You've
yes.
got 6 first-degree murder charges against a man in his mid-60s, cases that go back a number of years, several years.
Right.
How unusual is it?
Well, we've never had anything like it. I've had people in the past where I've charged them with multiple murders. Nothing quite like this. I don't think the City of Toronto has ever seen anything quite like this. A prototypical serial killer is what we're alleging, and we've never had that where it's come to this point that we've gotten to with this investigation. So there's been series of murders in the past before where no one's been caught for them, no one's been prosecuted for them, but this is definitely an unusual case.
Where would you estimate you are in this investigation now?
We're still in the very early stages. You've got to consider that you've got not one murder charge to gather evidence for and disclose to the prosecutors. You've got 6. So that's a huge undertaking in itself, and we're proceeding with that, but at the same time we're juggling cold cases that we're looking at. We've got unidentified remains that we're looking at. We're looking at outstanding missing persons cases. Obviously there's a lot of media attention, so there's a lot of liaison with that. There's still forensics going on. We're still in Mr. McArthur's apartment going through that forensically. Still a lot of digital evidence to go through, so we're a long ways from being finished.
You've said you foresee this not only lasting months longer, but years longer.
Quite possibly. Right now, our earliest murder is 2010, and if we start making links to cold cases earlier than that, depending on how far back we'll go, we'll keep going till we stop. And I've got no evidence right now to suggest there are any murders earlier than 2010, but if that evidence starts popping up, we're going to be doing this for a long time.
In your experience and in the conventional wisdom, when you've got a serial sexual killer, at what age would that person likely have started killing?
Well, there's been some experts in the media who would say late 20s, mid 30s. Everyone's different though. Would it surprise me if Mr. McArthur was linked to some murders from his late 20s? It wouldn't. Would it surprise me if his first murder was in 2010? That wouldn't either. So I don't think you can generalize people like this quite like that.
Right. Well, if you go back to Bruce McArthur's late 20s, you're back in the 1970s.
Absolutely.
And there are a number of killings in the gay community in Toronto in that time frame, several of which remain unresolved.
Right.
Definitively, would you look at those?
We are looking at those. We have pulled the cases from the 1970s that you're talking about, and we're going through those with a fine-tooth comb to see if there's any links at all.
Yeah. There were 14, I believe, in a space of four or 5 years in the late 70s, of which 7 remain unsolved.
Right.
When you look at those cases, what are the similarities to what you've had here, and what are the differences?
Well, in those cases, and I can't get too specific about what we're looking at, but I can say that in those cases, the victims were left where they were killed. The bodies weren't disposed of. I can say the manner of death is different.
Stabbing in many cases.
Stabbing in many cases from the 70s. So what I've got happening right now, I've got a team of investigators dedicated solely to those cases, and they're going through them, and they're generating a timeline for each case and a synopsis of exactly what we have. And if there's anything of value for forensic testing, we're getting that into the Center of Forensic Science as well.
I guess it's self-evident, but what are the difficulties of approaching cases that have been cold for 40 years?
Well, if you look at a homicide case from present day, the bulk of our work is surveillance videos, cellular phones. Things that just didn't exist back in the 70s. So back in the 70s, they're relying heavily on witness statements, and if they don't have any witnesses, they don't have any witnesses. They can't manufacture the evidence. So you have the evidence that's preserved from the scene, and hopefully it's still intact, and we can do something with that in the modern day.
Can DNA survive over that period of time?
Yes, it can.
Fingerprints?
Fingerprints can survive, DNA can survive.
Hair evidence?
If there is any hair evidence, it could survive as well. Whether it's suitable for DNA analysis is another question. So we're going through all of that. And our cold case squad, that's typically what they do, not just with these cases, but with other cases as well. So we have some officers from the cold case squad assisting in going through some of the exhibits as well.
When you talk about the modus operandi, where many of these were stabbings back in the 1970s, the cases that Bruce McArthur's been charged with are not stabbings. Is that known in the scientific evidence that there could be that kind of evolution in methodology by a serial sexual killer?
Well, I don't think I've ever said what the formal cause of death is in relation to Mr. McArthur's alleged victims. So I haven't ruled out stabbings. What an expert scientist might say, based on psychology, whether they could be related or not, I haven't got a definitive answer for that yet. So.
Give me a sense of where you stand, please, with the planters that were found on Mallory Crescent and the remains found therein. What do you have as we sit here today, and what might you still have?
We have, and there was a little bit of criticism about this, and I don't have the exact dates with me, but 2 press conferences ago, I stood in this room and I told the media and the public that we had the remains of at least 6 individuals in those planters from Mallory. And a couple of weeks later, I stood up again and I said, no, I can now confirm that we have 7. And people were wondering, well, why did you tell us 6? And I think the distinction was obviously, I said at least 6. And Dr. Palanin stood up after I talked, and he explained the methodology that they're using. You're dealing with dismembered body parts and trying to establish how many different people you have within those body parts. So it's not as if we missed any. It was just a matter of putting them back together and sorting them as best as the pathologist could do. And that took some time before we could say we had 7, and I'll still say at least 7 at this time.
So given the issues of freezing and winter and all of that, is it possible that you have not found everything there is to find at
Mallory? I'd like to go back to Mallory. We did quite an extensive search of Mallory. We took every planter from Mallory, whether the dogs hit on them or not. We've gone through every planter. I think we've got as many remains as we're going to get out of the planters. But I think you're aware we also thawed the ground in the backyard at Mallory and did some digging there, essentially in the middle of the backyard. It was quite a large area, about 20 feet by 20 feet that we excavated and didn't find anything. The backyard itself is surrounded by a lot of trees and vegetation. So I can't imagine anyone digging in those areas to hide more bodies. It would be very difficult. But it does back onto a ravine. We have been back there since we took the scene down because the weather has been getting a bit warmer with the dogs. We haven't had any luck yet, but we'll definitely go back there as many times as it takes till the ground is thawed and we can do a thorough search.
Speaking of the disposal of the bodies, this was obviously a very elaborate way of doing that. What does it tell you about the person who may have done it?
Well, I think there's several theories that you can advance in relation to the dismemberment of the bodies, the hiding the parts and the remains in planters? Is he doing it as a form of trophy keeping? Is he got a system going for the decomposition process, and is there something he does with remains after they've decomposed sufficiently? We just don't know that yet, but obviously he's taking steps to cover up what he's done, where he's disposing of the body. He's not simply throwing the body into a ravine somewhere to be found years later or months later. He is very diligently taking steps to cover his tracks.
We've spoken to forensic psychiatrists who address how stressful that must be, how difficult physically, emotionally, psychologically, doing that to a number of human bodies would definitively be.
I can't imagine. I mean, we've seen dismemberment before. I've been to countless autopsies in my career, and I can't imagine what it would take mentally to bring yourself to actually cut up a human body and deal with the contents of the body as you're doing that, and then digging up a flower pot and depositing it in there and putting it in someone else's backyard. So there's definitely something not right going on in your mind if you're able to do that.
Going back to the 70s, in that time frame where the 7 unsolved murders, still unsolved murders, were taking place, there was a not dissimilar kind of relationship between the Toronto Police Service and the gay community as one that's been commented upon recently.
Right.
Is that a factor for you, then or now, when you're investigating homicides? Can that figure into it?
The historical relationship?
The relationship at the time. I think it's fair to say back in the 70s, there was a great deal of distrust between the gay community in Toronto and the police service.
Right.
I think that is we're told it's much improved today, but there still is an element, a less mainstream element, where that may be the case. In either event, well, let's talk about now.
Okay.
How does that figure in what you do, or does it?
I haven't seen it negatively impact our investigation. From a homicide perspective, you're dealing with the most serious crime on the books in Canada, and we really haven't had a negative impact as far as cooperation goes. What we have had is people coming forward with information in 2018 in relation to Mr. McArthur that they've had in their pockets for years. And in 2013, we had made quite a large appeal for information in relation to those missing persons. And some of those people who have come forward with that information now either weren't aware of the missing persons or didn't feel that the information would be helpful at all. So maybe we have to do a better job communicating that at the outset. Maybe we needed to do a better job of communicating that in 2013. But that's really the only thing I would say that has hampered the investigation a little bit. I don't think that's a breakdown between the gay community and the police. I think that's merely a communications breakdown that you could see in any facet of society.
Yeah, and when you've got people who are part of what some call a racialized component of the gay community, is that still an issue that they, because of whatever their ethnic or cultural background, they can't identify themselves as being gay, and therefore can't come forward, however much they might want to?
Yeah. In some of the cases, definitely. Saroush Mahmoudi, as you know, was reported missing in 2015 by his family. They had no idea that he was gay, and he's one of McArthur's alleged victims. Abdul Faizi, who went missing in 2010, and I still can't say whether he was one of McArthur's victims or not, was also hiding his sexuality from his family. So that makes it a little more difficult, where you get that missing person report for someone like Sarouche, and you're trying to build a database with missing gay males associated to the gay village of South Asian descent. And that missing persons report comes in, and you're like, well, no, he's married, he's got kids, he lives out in Scarborough, there's nothing to associate him. His family thinks he's merely picked up and gone back home. So I think he probably would have come very close to not even being reported missing at all in 2015. And then when we found the evidence we did in January in trying to identify who this person was, we wouldn't have been able to identify him. And that may be the case with the unidentified man whose picture I put out a couple of weeks ago. We still don't know who he is. We're still working on a lot of tips, but we still don't know who he is. And may he have fallen into that category as well? That's quite possible.
There's been a call by John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, for an external investigation. How unusual is that sort of thing in the middle of a murder investigation?
Well, I've never seen it. I mean, I've dealt with inquests in the past, and the inquests usually occur after conviction and appeal period is complete, because we do have to preserve evidence for the court process, and people don't always understand that either. There's not a lot we can put out there for public knowledge and consumption until the court process is done. That's our main priority right now, is preserving that prosecution. So I agree with the mayor. I welcome any review of the investigation, not just my investigation, but the Houston investigation, the 51 Division investigation. If there's things we can do better, then we should learn from it. I've never seen a perfect investigation. You're always going to get criticized. There never is going to be a perfect investigation, and you're always going to have 20/20 hindsight when you look at it. But I think we've done a pretty good job on this investigation. We've got someone in custody charged with 6 murders. Like I said, it's not the first time we've done that, had a serial killer in custody. So,
when did you first hear the name Bruce McArthur?
That I can't comment on.
It has been widely reported that he first came, at least came to the attention of the police back in 2003, when he was charged with attacking a sex worker with a metal pipe and got a conditional sentence. It's been reported that he was interviewed during Project Houston, of which you were part,
right,
and that more recently in 2016, he was accused of trying to strangle somebody during a consensual sexual event. So can you confirm those 3 incidents before all of this?
I can't, and I haven't spoken about them before, and that's something that I have to preserve. Mm-hmm. If it's been reported in the media, that's one thing. It's come from sources other than myself. The only thing I've commented on is the 2016 incident, and that came to my attention some time ago. And several weeks ago, I actually had the opportunity to sit down and go through that incident with a bit of a fine-tooth comb. And based on what I learned about what had been done and what hadn't been done during that incident, I referred it to professional standards, and they initiated that investigation.
In terms of identifying something as a serial killing, what limitations do you have there?
There's been a lot of vocal opinions put out where people have said, we've told the police all along it was a serial killer. Mm-hmm. And we told the police in 2013 that obviously there was a serial killer. The police service itself, and I was involved in it in 2013, put out flyers and media releases and said, we've got these 3 missing persons. we've got Scannon Avaratnam, we've got Abdul Faizi, we've got Majid Kayan, two of them missing in 2010, one of them missing in 2012. And we don't know what's happened to them. A lot of people jump on that and say, well, obviously there was a serial killer at work. Well, is that something that's possible at the time? Absolutely. And is it something that we're considering? Absolutely. But until I have evidence to say that there is a serial killer, no one in the police service would stand up and say, we're speculating that there is a serial killer without evidence to support that. And I can relate it to a couple of different incidents where missing persons, if someone's missing, it doesn't mean that they've been murdered. And if someone's missing, can you attach a criminal offense to that occurrence? If you can't attach a criminal offense to that occurrence, it's a missing persons investigation. A lot of missing persons, I think we receive thousands of missing person reports every year in the city, and the vast majority of them are resolved within 7 to 30 days. There was a missing person in 2010 that we also looked at during Project Houston, and we never lumped it in with the other three because he didn't quite fit the profile. He was a white gentleman who went missing. But we were still concerned about it. And lo and behold, he turned up in 2014. Almost 5 years later, he simply didn't want to be found. We had another missing person in 2016 who fit the profile to a T, from the gay village, South Asian descent, gay male, disappeared off the face of the earth. He was found in Lake Ontario 4 months later. He had committed suicide. So can you imagine if I had stood up and said, we've got these missing persons, we think there's a serial killer, the criticism I'd face when it turns out they're not missing, right? And we do have missing males who have simply picked up and gone back to the countries that
Sure.
they originated from. So,
is there a downside to saying we don't have absolute proof, but we fear there may be a serial killer?
I wouldn't say it without having the evidence of that. I think there is a downside. I think speculation is dangerous. An obvious downside is if you speculate that there is a serial killer, and let's hypothetically say you have a fourth missing person on top of those three, and you clump them together and say, we think there's a serial killer. But then you find out that fourth person has actually been murdered by someone, and that's the only murder that suspect has committed. What do you think the defense lawyer is going to do in court? When you stand up and say, we think there might have been a serial killer, he's going to say, well, obviously it's not my client who killed this fourth person because there's a serial killer at work, right? You can't put false speculation out like that.
Is there a worry, though, that you may be, well, there has been criticism that had a serial killer been mentioned earlier, public behavior might have been altered. People might have been more careful and not taken chances that some of them did.
I think that we did a pretty good job in 2013 of saying, look, we've got these three missing men. We don't know what's happened to them. We are concerned. We don't know what's going on, but we want the public to be aware of it. And that media campaign occurred in the summer of 2013. And in 2017, we also put out quite a bit of information with the Salim Essen occurrence and the Andrew Kinsman occurrence, where we could relate them to dating apps. And we put out the information to be careful if you're using these dating apps. I don't know that it would have made any difference to use any different language than what we did use. And like I said, we can't put out language like that. We have to be very careful with the language that we use when we put out things like that.
It's interesting, back in the late 70s, in the period where these 7 unresolved killings took place, the Body Politic, the gay community's newspaper, had a big story which they called Overkill, about the unsolved murders. And the sub headline was, "Might one person have been responsible for all of this? The police aren't saying," which sounds like something that might have been on social media recently. Are you aware that that was a factor back then?
Not as specific as what you have. I'd be interested to read the article. But again, in the 1970s, much like in Tampa recently, it's quite one thing to say we've got these 7 unsolved murders where we have victims, we have bodies, we know they've been murdered. Is it possible that there's a serial killer at work? And putting that out as to fast forward to 2013 where you have, I've got some missing men here. Yeah. Is there a serial killer at work? I think it's quite different, or as opposed to what happened in Tampa where they said we've got a serial killer at work. Well, obviously you've got a serial killer at work. You've got 4 people killed in a 5-week period, all with the same gun, right? I wouldn't be afraid to stand up and say something in those circumstances, nor would I be afraid if I had circumstances like they had in the 1970s to say the same thing. But it's quite a leap to go from missing person to homicide.
If Bruce McArthur is indeed guilty of what he's been charged with, and if he was active back in the 1970s, as you suspect maybe some possibility, where would that put him in criminal history?
Up there with some of the more notorious serial killers in history.
Are you aware of anybody who has been active over that period of time?
Over that period of time, not off the top of my head. I think there's some American cases, there's some cases that are still not solved where they've had serial killers at work for decades. I think there's quite a famous case out of Moscow where they had a serial killer at work for 40 or 50 years before they finally caught him. And if that does in fact prove to be the case with Mr. McArthur, what are the numbers going to be? I don't know. Hypothetically, if you're responsible for a series of murders in the 70s, why do you go quiet in the 80s and 90s? When do you start up again? Is it possible that there's 7 of them from the 1970s and then 7 or 8 of them from the 2000s, so that leaves you with 14, far short of some of the worst serial killers, but we'll see what we come up with.
Obviously, it's hard enough trying to figure out what's been going on for the past number of months or several years. How do you go back 4 decades? Where do you start?
We have well, we have quite a few officers on the project. We have 2 of them specifically looking at Mr. McArthur's life and creating a timeline. And if you look at some of the media has done a great job in tracking down his life from his early days in Northern Ontario through the 70s and through the 80s and through his employment history. And we're essentially doing the same thing, but we're interviewing witnesses as we go in case we need their evidence for court. But we're creating very similar timelines to what you've seen in I think the Toronto Star today, a very complete timeline of his life. We're doing the exact same thing. Ours is probably a little more accurate and, like I said, backed up with witness statements and work records and whatnot. But it's a very time-consuming process. We've had 2 officers working on it full-time for a month now, going to these small towns, going to Oshawa, interviewing neighbors, interviewing friends, interviewing classmates, and creating as close a timeline of his life as we can possibly create.
Yeah, this was a man who did some traveling later in life. In 1980, he and his wife Janice went to visit a couple, the Foote family, in London, England.
Right.
What do you do about that? I mean, is international travel part of this as well?
Yeah, and obviously the murders that we're accusing him of here in Toronto, it would be markedly different to accuse him of a murder in another country while he's traveling with his wife. It's not out of the realm of possibility. We are looking at some international cases, not necessarily from 1980, but from some other years. And I don't have anything yet to suggest that he's murdered anybody in any other country, but it's definitely something that we're looking at.